How then do I start a layers chicken farm? In the previous class or video, I discussed in general of the 3 key factors you need to know in starting a chicken farm. I was talking about chicken farming in general. But now, I want to discuss layers chicken farming. For those of you who are seated there and are interested in starting a layers chicken farm, this is going to be a summary of what is required or what is the guide to start a layers chicken farm. My name is Antonio Innocent Mdongi, a poultry nutritionist, and welcome to this episode where we discussed on how to start a layer chicken farm. If you are new to our YouTube channel, guys, just do the necessary. Hit the subscribe button. Always like our video, always share it. And even as I discuss on the general requirements or general guide on how to start a layers chicken farm, I've also at the back done for you something good. I've done for you a video or a masterclass which has got any detail that you might ever want to know in terms of the specific medications, specific vitamins, how what amount of feeding regime, lighting regime, some of the common diseases to expect in layers. I've done a masterclass that before you think about starting a farm, you go and get the masterclass. It's on our website, and I've shared a link to our website right below here. Click on the link, get to our website, choose the masterclass of your choice, and enjoy. Now, Antonio, I'm working, but I want to quit my job. To do what? To start layers chicken farming. Before you quit your job, you have first to understand these common things, which to me, I would refer to them as cliches, before starting a layers chicken farming business. Specific layers. 1, before you think of starting a layers chicken farming business, just know that you'll be broke for 5 months or 5 months plus. Why? Layer birds start laying at 16 weeks, and I say 16 weeks if properly fed, properly managed. If all routine management practices are adhered to. In research, we used to call it ceteris paribus, a Greek terminology referring to every other factor held constant. That's when you see an egg, but not assured, at week 16. Mostly laying will start at week 17 and proper laying at week 18. Then laying that I can refer to as something that is worth it, maybe week 20, week 21. Week 21 you can see about 85% production. So it simply means that if you want to start a layers chicken farming business, you have to know that you will first buy day-old chicken. You will feed them for 5 months. During these 5 months, you shall be vaccinating them. In case of a disease, you will treat them. And all these are expenses right from your pocket before you get a shilling. In the first or the previous video, I talked about the type of money. So, if at all you're going to invest into layers, look for the type of money that if it's a loan, you'll be given a grazing period of 7 months plus. Mostly, I will advise you to go for loan facilities that give you something called an agricultural loan. A loan that will give you time to invest, harvest, then start repaying. But layers farming is one of the best business ventures I will always advise anybody to go into. But remember, a business venture that is more profitable has got the highest risk. Yes, you could feed your layers birds for a whole 6 months or 7 months. They start producing, and then that's the time that the birds will remind you you skipped the repetitive Newcastle vaccination dose at the 3rd month. then you lose 50%, 80% of your birds. That was a loan borrowed, then you've got nothing to repay. So you've got to borrow another loan to repay that one, or you have got to borrow other monies to repay that one. You think about starting a layers farming business, and because you're so much focused on cutting costs, because AIM Agriculture keeps singing how to make cheap feeds, how to do this cheaply, how to do this cheaply, how to do this cheaply. No. What guides us is the scientific requirement, because anything we are doing today, even this drinker that I've suspended to this level here, is guided by research. Someone somewhere in a university somewhere got a degree from suspending a drinker. He did a study on the spillages of water of a drinker at certain ages. So be guided by science in a nutshell. If you're going to do layers production, apart from feeding them for 5 months without getting a shilling, you have to be very, very, very cautious with vaccination. The business is very profitable, but the business is very risky, extremely risky. So then, the only way we can insure ourselves or cover ourselves from that risk is through avoiding of theft, in terms of guys breaking into the farm and stealing birds, or the eggs being sold and then they're not the eggs being stolen and sold, or the biggest fear of mortalities. Briefly, what are some of the major causes of mortalities in layers? I've discussed this fully and in details in the masterclass, but I just mentioned in a nutshell. One is disease. The bacterial, viral, and protozoal diseases. Most problematic is viral. And so, do not fail to vaccinate your birds on time. In the masterclass, I've discussed, for example, your birds can be due for vaccination, let's say tomorrow. Then, because your birds are due for vaccination tomorrow, then you walk into the flock house today, you realize that, hey, I'm having some coccidia. The birds are they are dropping, their droppings are bloody. So that means that you have to treat those birds. But remember, tomorrow is the vaccination date. You see? There's an outbreak today, but tomorrow there's a vaccination. After a few days, you've been giving an antibiotic, there's an outbreak of coryza in the village or Newcastle disease in the village. So you are caught in between. AIM Agriculture said that you cannot vaccinate a sick bird, you cannot give a bird on antibiotics a vaccine, then you're like, oh, I have to vaccinate my birds, I have to treat my birds. I've explained how you can maneuver in the masterclass. But my point is, do not miss to vaccinate the birds at the right timing. So if you vaccinate all these diseases, against all these diseases, then you are now assured that as much as I'm investing in this layers business, anything can come, yes, but for diseases, I'm covered. Remember, we have now a vaccine on coryza, infectious coryza, a disease whereby the chicken eye swells, then it bursts, or you press it, something comes out like pus. We have a vaccine for coccidiosis. We have it. Now, the thing is, when and how do I administer these vaccines? So now, for a layers chicken farmer, it's very important that then you vaccinate your birds to avoid the risk of losing the birds. You know I have to feed them for 5 months without a shilling. You know I have to vaccinate them religiously. Then now you come and say, what equipment am I going to use? Of course, some people will say the equipment that you use in a broiler's chicken farm has got no much difference with the equipment you use in a layer's farm. It could be true, but not very true. It could make some sense, but not very much sense. Let me discuss it right from the structure. In layers, the number of birds per meter square. Some people will go for 6 birds per meter square, others 8, others 10. That is a good point. In broilers, we are guided by the number of birds per meter square, and we stick to that religiously. But in layers, birds will be at the same spot for more than 100 weeks. That simply means the place has to be very, very much well done, more so ventilated. We increase the number of birds per meter square in layers with increase in the ventilation. In school, we are told ventilation has to be at least 6 feet. You know, the wire mesh, 6 feet. 6 feet in layers means that ventilation is 6 feet, but then the birds per meter square should be 6 to 7. But if you go further into research, that is production, if you're a farmer yourself, and also if you read more articles, you find that you can increase this ventilation from 6 feet, push it to 8 or 9, but then it will give you an advantage of increasing the number of birds per meter square. You get the sense? You get the sense? So in a nutshell, in layers, you can increase slightly the number of birds per meter square with increase in ventilation. In layers, you will build the structure, but most people will forget one thing. That when you're doing the laying boxes, that will cover and take space. When you're doing the routers and patches, which you don't do in broilers, that will take space. In layers, the level of raking or harrowing, the bedding, and the frequency is higher than in broilers. This is a bird that is very active in scratching the ground, and therefore simply means that your floor has to be concrete. I recommend that as much as possible. Or you can do blocks or bricks in interlocking format, taking the shape of cabros. In short, the floor has to be firm. The broiler birds are lazy. I can use that in a layman's language. You know, they gain weight fast, they don't do much exercise, they can't do much scratching, but they only do fluffing. So you cannot tell me that a broiler bird will scratch the ground until it gets into the soil. So the reason why we are trying to say that for a layers farmer, you really have to pay much attention to the floor. The floor has to be blocks or bricks, or the floor has to be made with very good concrete, is because these birds are very good at scratching the ground. So you make the floor good in a way that they cannot scratch the ground to a point whereby they get in contact with the soil. Remember, the soil has got bacteria called edaphic bacteria. And this edaphic bacteria could also cause diseases or infections to the birds. You get the point? When we talk of the structure, then the layer structure is a little bit advanced compared to the broiler structure. When you get the masterclass, I give you a sample of a layer structure. For a broiler farmer, you are free to do any design, but don't oversimplify it. Because these birds will be here for 6 weeks, you do away with them, scrap off the bedding, do it out, and then now introduce new birds. So for layers, then it simply means that you have to start the business back at your mind, knowing that I'm going to feed them for 5 months or 7 months without getting much returns. Secondly, you have to say that for broilers, for layers, I'm going to be with the birds for a longer period of time, and therefore the risk is going to be very high. So you have to pay much attention to controlling the risks. And the biggest risk we've said is diseases. I've talked about the 2 extra diseases or the 2 extra vaccines that have been introduced. But in details, how to administer them and when, I've covered it in the masterclass, which I've shared a link in the description below. For layers, I've said the equipment we use in terms of the drinkers and the feeders are just say similar to those ones in broilers. But the only difference is in the structure. And just to emphasize a point, in layers, the size of the drinker, the size of the drinker, which mostly we refer to it in terms of liters, will determine the number of birds per each. We have a recommend that drinkers from 6 liters and above, we say 1 drinker is ratio to 50 birds. And so is the feeder. So in a nutshell, then layers will differentiate itself with broilers from that. Then now, layers will go for a whole 100 weeks plus. Let nobody lie to you that layers lay eggs every day when they start laying. No. Sorry for that. Layers will lay eggs, like the number of eggs produced is directly proportional to increase in age between week 16 and week 36, thereabout. And then it will be flat. And then the number of eggs produced or the egg production will be inversely proportional to increase in age from week 52 downwards or going onwards. So that's a thing you should expect. But in modern countries like Israel, people don't keep buying day-old chicks when the birds get to menopause. Automatically, when these birds get to menopause, that is about week 100, these birds undergo a process called molting. They shed off their feathers, they gain new feathers, then they start afresh. The molting process will take some time, about 3-5 months. Therefore, a farmer will say, this bird will be at molting stage for this period, and it's a heavy feeder. That's why most farmers will not molt their birds so that they start again a new cycle of laying. Because now, feeding a heavy feeder for a whole 3-4 months, it's just better you feed chicks, which will start as lesser feeders, then gain as heavy feeders. By the time they are now becoming fully heavy feeders, they have started producing. So economically, it makes sense. I don't know if you get that. But there are countries that are so modern that they do something called induced or forced molting. Before the birds get to the actual menopause, which is about week 100 for these Highland Brown Classic, they induce the molting at week 72. So it will take a shorter time. Then the birds will be back to laying again. However, molted birds will always produce very huge eggs. And if their diets are not paid to very good attention, then it simply means that you are likely to have something called egg peritonitis, where the egg cracks or breaks while it is still in the system of the bird before it comes out. And therefore, it automatically means that you lose that bird. Just to conclude, we might not talk literally everything about layers, like we've done it in the masterclass. But in layers, you have to pay much attention to the feeding regime in terms of the type of feed and the amount of feed and the raw materials you're using and the consistency in those raw materials. Because this bird is laying. So if it gets any shock or any stress, for that particular period it will be managing that stress. It simply means that it's going to cut the production, manage that stress, then gain back to producing. And so you will be losing. So we try as much as possible that by the time the bird gets to production, it is like a train on the rail. There is no obstacle at its front. So you have a smooth ride all the way from week 16 up to menopause week 100. And if you pay attention to all these factors, then you'll find yourself saying that I can never venture into anything else apart from layers production. But if you go for a shortcut, chip this, chip that, chip this, chip that, chip that, then you'll be in for a road shock. I love you so much. See you in the next episode.